Jesus Christ, I hate my family, Jake said to his friend. His friend gave him the usual look whenever he would say that, and said the same thing.
Why do you even bother with them anyway?
Come on, you know why. It's Christmas, right? So you have to be nice to everyone, even your family. We have the same conversation every year, Riley. Riley didn't reply, her usual action when Jake was right, which was most of the time. It was silent except for the chatter of the other bar patrons and quiet Christmas music in the background. It remained this way for the next few minutes as the two friends sipped on bottles of beer. 2 bottles each later, the bar was nearly empty, but the friends had said nothing to each other. Riley finally broke the silence with,
So you got this one, right, man?
There was a smug smile on her face, as this was her MO every time. Jake shook his head and answered with mock irritation. Yeah, sure, but you have to get the next one. There was a brief pause as Jake fiddled with his wallet, and then they both burst out laughing. Across the room, the bartender gave them a look, but didn't come over or interfere. Once they were outside the bar, Jake lit up a smoke and offered the pack to Riley, who graciously accepted. After the first initial puffs, they resumed the earlier conversation.
So why are you so miffed about your family this time?
My mother invited me over for Christmas dinner, and I just know that drunken son of a bitch will be there to fuck things up.
Gee, that's rough. Hey, do you want me to come along? Maybe to help if things get out of hand and you can't handle it?
Jake looked at Riley, who had a serious expression on her face despite the joking tone of her voice. Nah, you'd probably be the one to start the trouble in the first place if you were there, Jake replied, trying to keep the comedic motif of the conversation going, but Riley didn't even crack a smile. That is, until she began to speak, but the smile was more out of concern for her friend.
I'm serious, dude. Remember what happened last year?
Yeah, they never found that officer's ring finger. They laughed at that and Riley flipped Jake the bird. In all seriousness, that was what actually happened. The Christmas dinner last year ended with Jake's stepfather trying to stab at the others at the dinner with the carving knife, and the police were called. A struggle ensued when the responding officers attempted to subdue the stepfather, resulting somehow with one of the officers losing 2 fingers on his left hand, the pinky and the ring, only they never found the ring finger. What Riley didn't know was, when the stepfather was recovering in the hospital, the first bowel movement revealed a half-digested segment of flesh and bone. The day finally came, and Jake and Riley drove up the street, Christmas music playing on the radio. They pulled to a stop, sliding slightly in the icy street as they parked. Jake had a look of guarded relief on his face when he saw that the stepfather's car wasn't in the driveway. He was more guarded, as no car in the driveway didn't necessarily mean that the stepfather wasn't there, but maybe that he had just gotten one too many DUIs and his car had been impounded. Before Jake and Riley entered the house, I will describe Jake's mother, well, ever since she had met and married the stepfather in the course of less than a week. She was pale, withdrawn, and had been beautiful, though bruises now marred most of the former beauty. When she answered the door to Riley knocking, Riley took a step back in surprise. Jake's mother had changed so much, Riley couldn't even recognize her. The bruises and wrinkles that normally covered her face had faded, leaving her skin in a near-flawless state, and she greeted Riley with a big hug.
How are you, Riley? And Jacob, you look great. Come in. It's so cold out there.
Jake's mother released the befuddled Riley from the death-grip hug and ushered the confused-looking Jake inside, closing the door and giving her son a hug. Over his mother's shoulder, Jake and Riley exchanged confused, amused glances. Mom, you're kinda hurting my back, said Jake as he gave his mother a light pat on the shoulder before attempting to break the embrace. His mother hesitated, allowing Jake to squeeze out of her arms. Where's the dipshit? He asked, and Riley looked at him with shock, but his mother tilted her head to one side, confused.
What's a dipshit, Jacob?
Jake had his brow furrowed, and his irritation intensified as he elaborated. That freak you married, you know, the one that's always trying to kill us? Jacob's mother retained the expression of confusion, smiling at Jake.
I haven't been with anyone since your father. Don't you remember? Are you feeling all right, sweetie? You look a little flushed.
As Jake's mother asked this, he was backing towards the front door slowly, not really wanting to be a part of this insane charade anymore. Riley noticed Jake walking towards the door and rushed to his side, taking his arm. She forced a laugh, trying to lighten the situation.
Jake's just playing with you, Mrs. Marcus. I think he got into the eggnog a little early today.
Mrs. Marcus smiled and gave Riley a pat on the shoulder.
Oh, I get it. Haha. Maybe if he had a nice girl like you around to keep him in check, he wouldn't make choices like that so rashly.
Riley and Mrs. Marcus shared an awkward laugh, and Riley had to hold back from the urge to slap Mrs. Marcus for merely mentioning a relationship between her and Jake. Riley could remember growing up with Jake. As they grew older, Mrs. Marcus would jokingly hint that they should start dating, and in the junior year of high school, they actually went out on dates a couple of times, but decided it would be better off if they just stayed friends, as things would get pretty awkward down the line. It seemed that they caught it just at the right time, as the friendship just continued right on without a hitch. Back to the present. Mrs. Marcus excused herself and went to the kitchen, where she busied herself with dinner. Jake and Riley walked into the living room and sat on the couch, facing the Christmas tree.
This is pretty screwed up,
said Riley, looking with concern at Jake. Jake couldn't hear her. He was focused on the wall, lined with holes in the plaster, blood lining the edges of each hole where, presumably, the stepfather had taken out his rage. He thought he could still hear the shouts and punches, but they gradually changed to a light knocking in a voice that sounded like it came from deep within an echo chamber. Closing his eyes, Jake focused on the voice, and it began to clear, and soon he recognized it as Riley's voice. She was knocking on the wall beside Jake, trying to get his attention.
Yo, Jake, come back to Earth. We need you.
Huh? Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you, Riley. What were you saying?
I said, this is pretty screwed up, isn't it?
As Jacob opened his mouth to respond, his mother interrupted from the kitchen.
Dinner will be ready in about an hour. The others should be here any minute. So, can one of you get the door when they come, please? Sure.
Jake and Riley responded in unison, and then Jake's mother added,
I'm up to my elbows in shit, if you know what I mean.
Jake looked at Riley dead in the eyes, the look given answering her question without any words. 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang, startling Jake away from the rock-paper-scissors death match he was engaged in with Riley. I got it, he called, and he got up to answer the door. He went white as he opened the door to see his Aunt Carol and Uncle Frank standing there. Their eyes lit up when they saw Jake for the first time in years. Carol spoke up.
Is that Jake? You've grown so much since the last time I saw you. Are you alright?
Her smile faltered as she saw Jake's pallor. Yes, Aunt Carol, I'm fine. I think I might be coming down with something. Why don't you guys come inside? We're letting all the heat out. Frank looked at Jake, but spoke to Carol. Looks like Jeanette raised a responsible young man, he said with a proud smile. Frank was Jeanette's brother, and had always been proud when he learned that his sister was doing well raising Jake on her own. Jake took their coats and motioned for them to go sit in the living room. As he put the coats in the closet, he could hear Frank and Carol talking to Riley in the living room. They had never really met her, and from the light tone of the conversation, Jake could tell that they had taken a shine to her. Jake walked into the living room and was surprised by a pat on the shoulder and a voice. Nice one, Jacob. You sure know how to pick the ladies. Jake snorted laughter and looked at Riley, who had gone beet red, trying to curl into herself. No, Uncle Frank. Riley's just my best friend. Frank jostled Jake a bit and winked as he said, Okay, Jake. I understand. Jake sat on the couch beside Riley and gave her a playful shove, which both Frank and Carol smiled at. Carol cut in.
So, Jake, how's school going?
Jake raised an eyebrow, not really sure how to respond. Do you mean college? If so, it's okay, I guess. Carol had a playful look in her eyes and replied.
Wow, you sure are getting ahead of yourself. Why don't you finish high school first? Haha.
Jake once again exchanged a confused glance with Riley at that question. They both had graduated years ago, right around the time that Jake's mother got remarried, and coincidentally, that was the last time that Jake had seen them. But Aunt Carol, I graduated like 3 years ago. Don't you remember? You guys came to the graduation ceremony and everything. Frank and Carol looked at each other, confused. Jake continued with, Well, I guess you might have forgotten. It has been a long time since we last saw each other. The confusion deepened as Frank replied, "What are you talking about, Jacob? We just saw you a few months ago when you came to visit." Riley elbowed Jake and whispered,
Jake, I think you should stop. You might say something stupid. Just play along. We can figure it out later.
Jake nodded slightly and replied to Frank, "Oh yeah, I must have forgotten. Geez, I think I need to get more sleep." Carol and Frank laughed at Jake, and when they weren't looking, Jake flashed Riley a glance of despair. The awkwardness was broken with Jake's mother calling out from the kitchen,
Dinner's ready. Come and get it.
Frank and Carol rose, walking towards the dining room, and Riley rubbed Jacob's shoulder, trying to comfort him, despite desperately wanting just to run from this situation. Jake gave a weak smile of appreciation, and then they walked into the dining room. This was getting really messed up, and there was no telling how much worse it would get before the night was over. Jeanette set the covered tray at the head of the table, beaming as their dinner guest looked on in anticipation. She had really outdone herself this time.
Jacob, would you do the honors?
Jake looked at his mother in shock, as this was the first time she had ever asked him to carve the turkey. With his mouth gaping open, he nodded absently, his brain nearly broken from all the strangeness of this evening. Riley was staring at Jake, worried sick as he walked stiffly up to his mother and took a carving knife from her. When the knife was in his hands, Jake snapped his mouth shut and his eyes went wide. It almost seemed that he was being shocked, with his arms and legs remaining stiff and trembling slightly. None of the others seemed to notice this, with the exception of Riley, who was near tears as she recognized what was happening. This only ever happened after Jake had a particularly stressful experience with his family, and was trying to relate to her afterwards. Riley suddenly cried out,
No! Jake, don't do it!
but she was too late. Jake had relaxed and was lifting the lid off the roasting pan, revealing a steaming, delicious-looking turkey concealed within. He gave a patronizing, sarcastic look at Riley, saying, "But we can't eat unless I do it. Are you worried about everyone's health?" As he said this, the guests began to laugh at Riley, and once again, she tried to shrink into herself. Jake had started to laugh too when he saw what Riley was doing, no concern for his friend and what she was going through. He began to laugh harder as he started to carve into the turkey, and Riley was filled with fear as the turkey began shrieking. Once the turkey was sufficiently carved, the earlier laughter had lapsed into stifled giggles. Riley looked around the room and was filled with fear as she noticed everyone at the table had taken on a jaundiced skeletal impression. She looked at Jake with eyes filled with panic, and then something clicked inside of her. Memories poured out of her mind, coming from nowhere. Christmas is spent in Hawaii, with her shouting that we can't decorate a palm tree. The Christmas when her parents were fighting and her mother had kicked her father out. The Christmas that her father came back and murdered her mother and wounded her in the process. The same Christmas that she had spent with Jake and his mother recovering. The Christmas that she spent in the hospital with Jake at her side as she tried to overdose on sleeping pills. The Christmas that she had received a rubber ducky that was about 3 times the size of her 3-year-old body. Riley began laughing too, and the hysterical uproar from earlier re-erupted. As Riley watched Jake standing before the turkey, laughing uncontrollably, she saw the steam rising from the perfectly carved pieces turn dark, almost as if it were smoke. Riley awoke to Jake shaking her weakly.
Piss off.
The shaking grew stronger still, and Riley managed to open her heavy eyelids, and did a double take when she saw where she was, in a car filled with exhaust fumes. She woke up a little more now, and tried to sit up, but the roof of the car had been crushed, and she was pinned. She looked to the right, where Jake sat, also pinned. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, but otherwise seemed okay. There was a sharp pain in her arm as she groped in her pockets for her cell phone to call for help. After a few minutes of looking, she was unable to find the cell and gave up. Riley looked despondently at Jake, who had drifted back into unconsciousness, and felt her eyes grow heavy once again as the exhaust fumes strengthened their hold on her. There was a brief knocking on the window that Riley assumed was just another hallucination as she fell under. Aunt Carol and Uncle Frank opened the doors and hauled both Jake and Riley from the wrecked car. Exhaust billowed out of the openings as they pulled, and that caused Riley and Jake to stir. They looked at each other, then at Frank and Carol, and then burst out laughing. They lay on the ground, laughing as Carol and Frank ran back to the homeless shelter to call for help. Carol and Frank were never really there. They had either passed away or just completely disappeared after cutting off all contact with the family, and Jake's mother had been murdered in cold blood by her abusive, alcoholic husband. After that, Jake and Riley had raised enough money to set up a homeless shelter for victims of abuse after Jake had inherited the house from his mother, and when they pulled up in front that day, Riley had lost control of the car and it flipped. The exhaust fumes leaking in from the damaged car had caused the entire hallucination, and neither Jake nor Riley had ever come back to right again.